Thank you, and it's my great pleasure. We had this talk last year, and I moderated it. This year, my partner of 20 years, David Weiden, is going to moderate. Keith Rabois, and the 5 lessons he's learned from 5 different bosses. You know, Keith, as you know, was first an entrepreneur we backed twice. Then we brought him in as a partner. Then we sent him back to the minor leagues to Founder Fund to get some training. And I think he's ready for the big leagues now, so we brought him back. So please welcome them.
Good morning. Okay, let's see what we got waiting for us. So, Keith, as Samir said, you've worked at a number, I think the number's 5, so far, very successful companies. And let's
one failed company. Unfortunately, we worked together at that one.
It didn't really fail.
Failed by high standards.
It wasn't very successful.
Dave was a great board member, though.
Well, you can tell my background in marketing, they didn't fail. Anyway, let's share some lessons with the audience. Let's start with a broad question of, across those companies, what are some lessons that come to mind that apply to folks that I'd say are in the typical company that doesn't yet feel like it's LinkedIn or Square, but it's trying to get there?
Well, the interesting thing is every one of these companies was unique. There's almost nothing in common between, let's say, PayPal and Square. Similar business models, et cetera. But like literally almost every single decision would have been made differently in different criteria, different inputs, different outputs, different types of people even. The common denominator is talent density, though at the end of the day, Vinod's expression that he taught me when he was on the board at Square was the team you build is the company you build, and that is definitely true of all successful companies. And so that is the most important. Now, the formulation of how to get there varies. Not all these companies were explosive. LinkedIn was not explosive, so I spent almost 3 years at LinkedIn, 2.8 years, and I started as employee number 20. And when I left 2.5 years later, we were at employee 59. People forget that. Like, it took 2 years to get to 1 million users, which in a social product feels like an eternity. Revenue had like none for the first 2 to 3 years. In fact, when we hit $1 million of revenue, it was like cause for epic celebration. So like now, on the other hand, Square was like this, like literally vertical from when we launched for like 3 years. And so again, the trajectories, even for very successful companies, are very, very different too.
So let's look at LinkedIn then, because I didn't remember that it was that slow a ramp. So what can people take away from that? Like, how did LinkedIn get through that period?
The key was Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, was very savvy, and he knew what the ingredients for success were. He was very consciously aware that LinkedIn had to be a viral product. We could not afford to pay for customer acquisition. So almost everything was predicated on how do you create a true viral product, and there's ways of measuring it, et cetera. And that was like 80% of the resources. And once we nailed the viral product and we were like, the coefficient was above 1, then we could take time to build other products. And there was a heroic part of effort to LinkedIn that people forget, the proverbial YC advice of do things that don't scale. It was like, why would you start as a user in the first, let's say, 1,000, 10,000 users as LinkedIn? Why would you have a profile? It makes no sense. Like, there was literally no value proposition for the first 100 to 1,000 users. Once you have 100,000 users, lots of value to the user, to recruiters, et cetera. So using like brute force to get to the first 1,000 or 10,000 users was critical. Whereas like you can't really brute force like a PayPal for the most part. You can't really brute force Square, but Reid knew that he could brute force what he needed and how to do it. So we spent a lot of time actually brute forcing things. And then you could layer on the revenue. But to show you how non-intuitive LinkedIn success was, I got hired. I'd been an angel investor in LinkedIn from the beginning, so I was paying attention. I was literally looking at every single profile personally. Every single morning, I'd wake up and read every single person's profile that joined LinkedIn for like a year, just to see what the quality was. And I'd send feedback to the team, like maybe we're getting adversely selected here, or this is great, or so-and-so joined. But to show you how I was hired literally because the board had no confidence that the company could ever make money. So the most obvious way for LinkedIn to monetize was charge recruiters. But no one really knew there was these things like Monster, Hot Jobs, Career Builder, all these things that are on the ash heap of history now. And people were afraid that if we started to monetize through like recruiting, we would lose because we didn't have the biggest network. So the board basically told Reed, you need to hire someone to like develop alternative revenue streams because we don't really want to bet on recruiting because it's too competitive. So that's how I got hired, was to build alternative revenue streams. But now it seems like ridiculous. Like, of course LinkedIn can monetize through recruiting, but at the time it didn't feel that way. That was literally my job, was to wake up, come up with alternative revenue streams, and then created a whole separate engineering group to parallel track some of these things. So again, like with revisionist history, this seems like stupid. Like, why the hell would you be all stressed out about this?
You said something I wanted to do another pass on. You said Reed knew that he had to get viral acquisition working, and it sounds like Reed somehow knew it was more important to get that right than to grow more quickly. So how did he know that? How did that happen?
Well, Reed's smarter than your average like entrepreneur. You know, he definitely like has the whole world of technology mapped pretty well in his brain, and so he'd seen it, you know, work in other companies. And basically, like, you think about LinkedIn was really like a professional version of things like Friendster, and you know, obviously should have had more potential, truthfully, than like Friendster and later Facebook, because the monetization is just so much greater on the potential side per user. But so he had seen things like Friendster explode. He had done an early social network company himself. He'd invested in Friendster and was like, I got to get that formula working on the professional side.
Okay, let's talk about recruiting, because you mentioned that one of the key things you've learned from Some Wise Soul was that the company you build is the team you build.
Yeah.
Or the team you, yeah, that. So it's easy to say that, but how, especially if you're a company that isn't a hot company, that doesn't have a famous founder yet, how do you recruit great people?
Yeah, so this is like the hard part. There's two key lessons to building a startup from a talent density perspective. So Peter Thiel taught me, like, you have to hire only undiscovered talent. You can't go get like experienced people. That's how you have to compete. We can talk about why and how, and then Vinod, you know, succinctly express the team you build is the company you build. That's easy to understand and grok at a conceptual level. The practical part is really hard. Like, how do you find undiscovered talent? How do you attract undiscovered talent? How do you measure them, assess them, close them, and then promote them, groom them? That's all really difficult. And in fact, when I started my career at PayPal, literally my first week at PayPal in late 2000, went for a jog around the Stanford campus, and Peter's like explaining the importance of undiscovered talent. So I understood it as soon as he explained it, but the first 2 years I tried to apply it, I was a disaster. I was like 50-50 on hiring. Like, and that doesn't work. And so I couldn't do it, and I was very frustrated. It was actually sort of suppressing my promotions. And back then I was like really ambitious, and I was like, I got to get promoted, I got to get promoted. Everybody, the feedback was like, all the stuff you do works, but like you're not getting leverage because you don't have like a team that's creating 1 + 1 = 5. And so I finally had this epiphany that, okay, I'm not going to learn to interview people much better overnight. Like, that's just not possible. But I can go steal people from within the company, like that were undiscovered talent within the building, and I'll just recruit them into my team. And so I went around PayPal, like looking for like undiscovered people that weren't high leverage, and I found like 2 or 3, and I was like, hey, I got this great opportunity for you. And I actually converted a few of them, like 2 or 3 or 4, moved to my team, and they did really well. And the lesson from that was, A, I got promoted, but B, the lesson from that was, actually, my problem was not assessing people. It was assessing strangers. Like, internally, I got all the recruiting internal moves correct. These people were phenomenally successful, and they did really great stuff. So then I was like, okay, great. The foundation of assessing undiscovered talent I now have. I just need to figure out how to do that for someone I meet off the street. And so it narrowed the skill gap. And then I was like, okay, what's the difference between the people I'm assessing correctly internally versus externally? And how do I bridge that gap? And then got some reps at that, and then was able to say, okay, I know how to do this, and I'm going to just keep doing that. But most people, like, this is a very dangerous strategy, truthfully, because until you've mastered the assessment piece, you're going to be firing pretty randomly, and building a company firing randomly doesn't work. I mean, I interviewed Patrick Carlson on stage here probably about 5-6 years ago, and Patrick had this great advice too. He said, like, the first 10 hires, so like companies here, a lot of you are like about 10 employees, first 10 hires, be incredibly judicious at the first 10, because every one of those first 10 is going to replicate him or herself 10 times. So be careful about those atomic units. If you don't want 10 more of that person, don't hire them. So like, all of this is really difficult to actually do. Now, if you're not hyped, One of the benefits of PR, so we're going to talk about PR later in launching, is it helps you generate inbound interest in the company. Outbound is really hard to find undiscovered talent by definition. It's like these people aren't discovered. How do you outbound? So you've got to create an inbound funnel, and that does sometimes require PR. Now you can use PR to substitute for actual traction. Once you get escape velocity, then people will find you sort of because it's in their interest to work at your company, but you've got to invert that cycle. So I actually tend to advise people to launch early and deal with the side effects of that, then suppress the news about funding and other traction until later, because it's the only way I know how to create like an inbound talent funnel. Now, if you can tap into the other secret that people advise, which does work, is find 1 or 2 people that are magnets for talent in your first 10. So someone who has a network of people that really want to work with that person. They can be earlier in their career trajectory, so they don't have to be like a VP. They can be a manager, but a manager who everybody on the team really wants to work with again. So you get 1 person, but then you wind up with 5. That can work pretty well.
You mentioned that lots of firing is not a formula for success. So how do you, when people are hired, what are some lessons you've learned about setting them up for success? And then how do you know when to give them more rope and be patient versus it was a mistake, get rid of them?
So the advice, I'm not sure, fortunately it's off the record. I actually think you can tell in 30 days or less on almost every hire, period. Maybe in 23 years of doing this, maybe there's like 7 exceptions to that rule where within 30 days I didn't know whether I'd made a mistake. There's academic research, by the way, on this topic that the single most predictive variable, that if you wanted to measure someone's success, if you ask the hiring manager about 60 to 90 days later, would you make this hire again? Just that question exactly worded, that will give you most of the information you need. The correlation coefficient is like 0.67. So like that's all you need to do. But anyway, I think you usually know, especially the more senior they are, the more experienced they are, the more definitively within like 2 to 3 weeks, you know in your heart. Now you may not admit it. You may not admit it to your colleagues, your co-founder, but you kind of know in your heart whether you made the right call. So then if you haven't made the right call, then the question is what to do. And then that question is like, well, what are the consequences? Because there are consequences every time you subtract people from a company. And are the consequences worse than the pain of having, let's say, a B+ person? Usually it's not like, oh, this person's a C. The hard part is it's a B+ and you need an A+. And then the variability there is, well, how important is this role to the company? So for example, different companies compete on different dimensions. So at Square, we competed through design. Literally one of the 2 ingredients to Square's success was competing through design. So if we didn't have absolute world-class designers, the whole company didn't make any sense. Most companies do not compete on the dimension of design. They think they do, but they don't really do it. And so if you hire a B+ designer, that may not catastrophically interfere with your business success. So you may let that one go. Or some companies, a lot of companies we work with actually compete on the basis of underwriting, like risk, assessing risk. If you haven't made the right hire in risk, you need to fix that right away. If that's the one way you're going to compete with the entire world, you better have like an A+ talent in that seat on every single day. And if you don't, go find somebody super fast. So it does depend how much asymmetry sort of is there in the role, whether you can live with a B+ and the consequences of swapping people out. One of the hardest parts for me as a VC is like, we don't really care about errors on one side. Like let's say 10 people pitch us for seed investments. It really doesn't matter if 6 of them fail, because we're in the business of finding the 3 or 4 like people who are going to change the world. You can't run a company that way, though, because every one of the 6 failures has consequences, collateral consequences, that can absolutely interfere with the rest of the organization. So you have to change your hiring philosophy versus my funding philosophy. I literally have to have a different brain on of like, VC, okay, one tail distribution is the only thing I need to worry about. Hiring, I need to worry about both tails, and like you have to change the algorithm.
Speaking of changing, let's talk about how should a founder navigate being persistent and just being patient and grinding versus experimenting, being agile?
Okay, so I'm going to give the official non-KV answer because my views are a little bit different than the official KV answer. Actually, I don't really believe in changing. I kind of believe that producing a startup is like a movie. And like, I actually highly recommend reading Mike Ovitz's autobiography. I think it's fabulous, first of all, as a book, and she's really fascinating as a person, but it actually applies to startups more than movies. And I think what you're doing when you're producing a movie is you have this vision in mind, and you have to write a script. And then you have to cast it. This is the hiring part. Casting the right actor or actress. Like, imagine like watching Devil Wears Prada without Meryl Streep. I don't think that movie works. And then you have to finance it, like producer, and then you have to direct it, and it's like more like the CEO. And so I think you have to have this vision and the script, and you have to cast it, and you may have to change the casting to get it right, and you have the opportunity to do that. Then you cut a trailer, and the trailer, whether you're a consumer company, has to interrupt people and be attractive and interesting, and arrest and cut through the clutter, and it has to sell tickets. And then you're always trying to figure out, okay, is the trailer broken? Maybe I need to recut a trailer. Or am I selling tickets? Well, maybe the pricing's wrong, or et cetera. Or the location of the movie theater's wrong, or whatever. You get variability. You get like control and dials and levers that you don't get in the movie business. But I think that's what actually most startups are. Now, once in a while, and the exception in my mind is by doing X, like producing this movie, you see a spark. And it's anomalous. Like, you didn't expect this spark. It's like anomalous data or an anecdote. And you're like, where the hell did this come from? Like, we were not trying to do this, but everybody seems to be going over there. And like, that is a good reason to change the movie. Almost any other reason is not a good reason, in my view, to change the movie. Like, I think it's like willpower. It's kind of like tenacity. It's like, Elon's like, I'm going to Mars. It's not negotiable whether he's going to Mars. It just is. And I think life is path, so now I'm shocking. In my view, life is path dependent, and there's like, those of you who know math, there's like a way to derive what path dependency means, but the short version, amateur level version is by deciding to go from point A to point B, you increase the probabilities just by saying that of getting from point A to B. So I don't believe in like sort of backup planning, because I think just admitting that has decreased the probabilities I'm actually going to succeed, and it's very much an Elon's school of thought, but it has consequences all the way down to like almost every decision.
Let's double click on that one level. Take a company like Uber that started out with the plan that we're going to buy cars and have drivers, and then we could debate whether it's a pivot, but it was definitely a meaningful change in strategy and execution to end up getting to UberX and things like that. How would you make that decision?
Yeah, so the UberX decision is pretty interesting because really what I think they did is they noticed Lyft was doing this and it was working. So they had an adjacent company and they could see it scaling. And actually it was pretty fascinating at the time because they took a high-end brand and went down market really, really fast, which is often dangerous, and it worked. It wasn't so obviously correct at the time. I remember kind of watching from afar. I was an angel investor in Lyft, and I was like, oh, wow, this is super rapid and dangerous, actually. So I think they had the benefit of, well, first of all, Travis had another benefit. I also interviewed him here a few years ago on stage, and it's worth watching this video. He was so ambitious that the idea of giving anybody else oxygen was incredibly inconsistent with his movie. He's like, I am going to dominate all of transportation. And when he saw something over there, it was inconsistent with his movie. So it wasn't like really pivoting for him. It was like, I am not letting anybody I want 100% market share, period. Like, there's going to be no cars, and I want all of that. And so I can't give anybody any oxygen, and I'm going to have to go faster to achieve it. So I think it was more founder mentality of what he wanted to do with the world, and it just led to this conclusion that, of course, we have to do this.
Okay. Another question, when you're running a company, what do you think of using, and you're trying to do planning, should there be aggressive goals or realistic goals, and do you have two plans or one plan?
Oh my God. Yeah, this is complicated. Maybe we'll talk about this with Max Rhodes later about running a board meeting because it's relevant. I tend to like one plan and pretty aggressive. And I think the reason why is I think you have to top down, if you're plotting this movie in the Travis sense or the Elon sense of going to Mars, there's reality of like, if you're going to go to Mars, there are certain things that are non-negotiable in getting to Mars. You just can't get to Mars unless you can do X, Y, and Z, or Uber wants to dominate transportation and shift consumption from purchases of cars to rental, effectively. So once you have a top-down vision, the goals are kind of top-down because they have to be, because you can't get from point A to point C. So you really can't have less than ambitious goals. And I think clarity and transparency, would be the next sort of topic, is important. So I don't think as a CEO you should have goals in your mind that you're not willing to share. and you need to share them with your co-founder, you need to share them with your executive team. You should share them, in my view, with each support rep. And then you should share them with your board. And so I think if you're running a transparent company, it's really difficult to have multiple goals, period, because it's kind of inconsistent to have two plans that you're not really sharing with everybody. And once you share two plans with everybody, it kind of undermines the whole point anyway.
Okay. What do you see founders doing that most frustrates you, where you think, like, just change this?
I think there's two things. One is before they take investment. I was talking to a couple of you like last night over reception about this. I don't think every founder takes seriously the idea of matchmaking. Like, it is much easier, it is almost impossible to fix a bad match. Like, once you raise money from the wrong people, that's like a decade-long decision that's almost irreversible. And I actually think many founders don't take advantage of the opportunity to find the perfect match. Now, not every founder has choices, but like a lot of founders do have choices. And so things like reference checking, like if I was a founder and I had like 5 options, I would definitely be talking to CEOs who'd worked with each of those 5 options and, you know, taking it very seriously. Secondly, like different firms have different strategies, different approaches, and matchmaking that. The thing that defies my belief is like founders often don't take advantage of taking more time to make a decision. So for example, anyone in the room, when you're considering an investor, if you ask them to spend more time with you, almost no investor I've ever met would say no. Like if you're like, hey, you know, I don't want to make a decision this week, I really want to study my choices, and you said, hey, can you meet me for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and I really want to get to know you, the firm, I want to meet all your colleagues, whatever it is, if you actually ask that to a VC, almost every VC on the planet would say yes, but very few founders actually take it that seriously, and it's basically irreversible. So that drives me absolutely crazy when I see founders do it. Obviously, once we're involved, we tend to advise founders to, you know, matchmake correctly, and we can give advice based upon lots of years of experience. The second thing, post-investment, I'd say the global phenom that actually drives me crazy is when every board meeting feels like, what's that, Groundhog Day. So there's companies where the progress between board meetings and the topics between board meetings are constantly changing. Every board meeting is interesting and arresting because whatever was the top topic last time has been thought about, addressed, processed, and there's feedback. Mediocre companies or mediocre founders, it feels like going to a board meeting a year later is the same board meeting.
Okay. What's something that you think that you'll share here, but you haven't shared or wouldn't share on a broadly shared podcast?
I already stole a few. Like I already gave a few of those. Yeah, I don't have any like particular, but you can.
Then another flavor of that is, what's something controversial that you've changed your mind about?
Oh, lots. So for example, like, I mean, you know this, we've been working together since 2008. I used to believe like Silicon Valley was the epicenter of everything. Like I actually literally only invested like in Silicon Valley companies, blah, blah, blah. Obviously I've changed that, you know, moved to Miami, try to find as many non-Silicon Valley companies as I can for lots of reasons, which we could talk about which ones are still applicable, et cetera. So that's a pretty radical shift. Top-down versus, the other thing is I grew up in a empirically driven, data-driven culture. Everything at PayPal was empirical, every decision. Like I had to learn and prove to my colleagues that I could do like calculus and advanced statistics. That was the other thing that was getting in the way of my promotion was Peter had this view that I didn't do math well enough. So I spent like 6 months like sending out the most quantitative emails possible. And then he actually realized, actually, I do statistics better than he does by a lot, but I still do calculus much worse. But fortunately, statistics is more relevant for most companies than calculus is.
Okay, last practical question for folks. I know we often give people the advice to raise money early. But what do you do if you just did a round and you only have a year runway when you do the round, and or it's just a hard fundraise? Yeah,
on the hard fundraise, so I don't know if this is uniform advice around KB. I think it actually is more at KB than, let's say, the subprime place I used to work. In Samir's language. Seriously though, I think at KB, I generally tell founders, don't worry about runway, worry about lift. And like, I actually like the metaphor because if you think about lift in the you know, seriously, like a plane context, company's only valuable if you achieve lift. Like, runway is a tactic for achieving lift, and you may need to extend the runway so that you have more time to get lift. But unless you're actually achieving lift with that extra time, it doesn't help you. You haven't achieved anything. So to me, the runway is a derivative calculation. So I hate, like, when a founder's like, I want to raise this much money because it gives me 2 years of runway. I'm like, that is stupid. And I usually tell founders this on the fly. I'll be like, that is a stupid way to think about your fundraising. Like, it's what do you need to achieve? We think about what are the 3 key risks to a company. When we invest, we write internal memos about what are the 3 key risks to this company. So what are the 3 inflection moments? And you usually can't achieve all 3 in one financing. It's like, what's the most important inflection? And then everything is derived from how do I achieve that? And so I will often advise founders to let, like, sort of your fuel tank go very low, like down to almost 0. If you really feel like you're approaching lift, don't worry about whether you have 1, 2, 3, 5 months of runway. And then a lot of founders get very bad advice where it's like, oh, you need to have this much runway or you won't be able to raise money from strength and all that stuff. I'm like, that's nonsense. If you have traction, if you hit viral coefficient of 1 with 3 months of runway, almost every VC on the planet knows how to invest in that company and it will not be a problem.
Well said. Okay, we have time for questions. Is that right? Yeah. Let's take of anyone back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Keith, I was curious, how did you bridge the gap between being really good at assessing talent internally, but not very good at assessing talent that was strangers?
Yeah, that's a great question. First thing was just getting more data points. So if you think about the biggest difference, I had a lot of data points about these people in the building at PayPal. And when you meet a stranger on the street, any interview process is fairly inexact. And so it's like, how do I get more data points to, like, kind of bridge that gap? That was the easiest. I still had to later develop, like, hey, you're not going to have all these data points about everybody you need to interview. But that I could defer that and just hire people where I could get more data points that would be closer to the closer proxy.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah. Was there any, like, major differences between office spaces at these companies that you worked at? Like, do you have any strong thoughts on, like, good or bad offices?
Yes. So this is maybe counterintuitive, although I think it's more popular. So one of the first companies I joined the board of in 2003 was this company called Zoom. Unfortunately, not the Zoom that we all use. It was with an X. It was like money transfer company. It did pretty well. It went public. But I remember when my friend, the CEO, Kevin Hartz, was like considering moving offices, and he articulated at this board meeting that he was going to personally go check out the 5 top options. And I remember, this was my first board ever, thinking that's insane. Like, the CEO is literally going to go on 5 office tours. And I was like, that seems like the most, like, backwards use of time. Now I would actually highly, and several of you are CEOs I work with, highly recommend that the CEO go tour all those 5 offices personally, because if you think about a culture, and we'll talk about a culture in detail, but culture is like a cult, and the environment you're in dictates how people behave. One of the reasons why I actually joined KV the first time, 2013, almost all of you probably have been to our offices, I was like, this vibe in this office is exactly what I want. Like, both like relaxing but tasteful, and all the details. You know, Vinod is incredibly obsessed in details, and I believe in the details matter. Score takes care of itself kind of stuff. Similarly, like these whiteboards that are magical, that actually are beautiful and they work, which nowhere else on the planet seems to have these whiteboards. It just all came together in my brain that I will just fit in here. So I think, like, CEOs actually need to pick an office consciously. And there's different styles of offices. Like, some companies are more frugal, and it reflects through everything they decide. So you don't have to have the most elaborate, fancy office, but if your culture is frugal, then your office should reflect the frugality. If your office is like Square, we were a design-driven culture. The office should reflect every last detail being perfectly designed in the office, because you're reinforcing the traits you want. So I think it's critical now. So that's one of the things I changed my mind on.
Okay. Another question?
There's one over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the spirit of changing your mind, I think last year you mentioned absolutely no remote work.
Yeah.
And, you know, you also mentioned that the Silicon Valley is like no longer the epicenter of everything. So what about the exception where it's like, if you want to hire the talent that you know is perfect for your company, but they either don't want to move to the Silicon Valley or have restrictions that make them have to be remote, but they're really good. would you
So,
rather?
yeah, Elon has the perfect formulation of this. He publicly tweeted this a few years ago. He's like, if you're the single best person on the planet, I'll consider it. Most people are, in fact, not the single best person on the planet.
I think that's a good, focused way to end. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks.